In a quiet suburb of Seattle, a murder occurred that shocked not only the local residents but all of America. James Harris, a 38-year-old successful businessman, was found dead in his own home. At first glance, it seemed like a typical crime of passion, but behind the facade of this tragedy lay a complex web of lies, betrayal, and family secrets. The main suspects were two women, James's wife, Emily, and her sister, Sarah. Both claimed their innocence, but the evidence suggested otherwise. This is a story of how love can turn into hatred and family bonds into a weapon of revenge. Emily and James Harris seemed like the perfect couple. They met 10 years ago at a corporate party where Emily was working as an event planner and James was a rising star in the world of finance. Their romance developed rapidly, and within a year, they had a lavish wedding at a country club in Seattle. Sarah, Emily's younger sister, was always close to the newlyweds. She frequently visited their home, helped organize family celebrations, and was a trusted confidant for both spouses. Outwardly, their relationship seemed flawless, but, as is often the case, things were different behind closed doors. The first signs of trouble in Emily and James's marriage appeared about 3 years ago. James started staying late at work more frequently, explaining it away as important projects and client meetings. At first, Emily, busy with her career as an event manager, didn't give it much thought. However, she gradually began to notice changes in her husband's behavior. James became distant, Emily later told investigators. He would sit in his office for hours, glued to his phone. When I asked who he was texting, he always said it was work-related. Sarah, who was often at the Harris home during that time, seemed unaware of these changes. She remained the life of the party at family dinners, entertained the kids, and supported her sister in her career endeavors. No one could have imagined that Sarah would be the one to cause this family's downfall. The situation escalated when James began to show an unusual interest in Sarah's affairs. He started asking more about her life and offered to help with her financial issues. Emily chalked it up to brotherly concern, but her intuition told her something was wrong. "I remember once catching them together in the kitchen," recalled family friend Melissa Clark. "They were standing too close and whispering. When I walked in, they quickly pulled away from each other. I thought they were planning some surprise for Emily, but now I realize how wrong I was." Feeling like she was losing control, Emily began to watch her husband more closely. She checked his phone when he was in the shower and browsed through his computer's history. But James was cautious and left no obvious clues. Relations between the sisters also began to change. Sarah started visiting the Harris home less frequently, and, when she did, she was unusually quiet and avoided direct contact with Emily. "I felt like Sarah was hiding something from me," Emily said, "but I could never have imagined she was capable of such betrayal." The tension in the family was growing, and everything seemed to be heading towards an inevitable conclusion. No one could have predicted how tragically this story would end. Emily, James, and Sarah found themselves caught in a whirlwind of events that would forever change their lives and lead to irreversible consequences. The relationship between James and Sarah began subtly, almost by accident. That evening, Emily was working late, organizing a large corporate event. James, returning home earlier than usual, found Sarah there, finishing up some cleaning after her visit. "I just stopped by to see the kids and help out around the house," Sarah later explained. James suggested we have some wine while we waited for Emily. I agreed, not suspecting where it would lead. One glass turned into two, and the conversation became more candid. James complained about the growing distance between him and Emily and her constant preoccupation with work. In turn, Sarah shared her own personal struggles. Perhaps it was this mutual vulnerability that catalyzed their closeness. "I never intended for this to happen," Sarah confessed during questioning. But at that moment, James seemed so understanding, so attentive. He listened to me in a way no one had in years. Their first kiss happened spontaneously while they were putting away the wine glasses in the kitchen. Both immediately pulled away, frightened and embarrassed by their actions. They swore it would never happen again, that it was just a moment of weakness. But fate had other plans. In the weeks that followed, James and Sarah began to find excuses to meet. Innocent messages about the kids or weekend plans turned into lengthy text exchanges. They met at a cafe on the other side of town, supposedly to discuss a birthday gift for Emily. I knew I was doing something wrong, James admitted to his friend and colleague Michael Thompson. But with Sarah, I felt alive. She understood me in a way Emily hadn't in a long time. Their relationship quickly escalated. What started as an emotional closeness soon turned physical. They met at a hotel on the outskirts of town, each time coming up with new excuses for their absences. Sarah felt intense guilt toward her sister. Every time I saw Emily, I wanted to tell her everything, she said. But the fear of losing both my sister and James held me back. James, on the other hand, became increasingly careless. He would spend hours texting Sarah, even when Emily was nearby. His behavior grew more and more suspicious. Emily began to notice the changes. James was smiling at his phone more often. He had sudden business meetings in the evenings and on weekends. He started paying more attention to his appearance and bought a new cologne. I felt something was off, Emily recounted. But I couldn't bring myself to believe James was capable of cheating, especially not with my sister. Emily's suspicions deepened when she noticed changes in Sarah's behavior. Her sister started visiting their house less frequently and, when she did, avoided making eye contact with Emily. Their conversations became superficial. Sarah no longer shared her problems or concerns with her sister. Emily began her quiet investigation. She checked James's phone bills, kept track of his schedule, and even hired a private investigator. But James and Sarah were careful. They used encrypted apps for communication and met in places where no one knew them. However, as is often the case, secrets have a way of coming out. James's fatal mistake was a forgotten hotel receipt left in his jacket pocket. Emily found it while preparing to take the jacket to the dry cleaner. I remember my hands shaking when I saw that receipt, Emily recalled. The date, the time, it all matched one of his business meetings. That's when I realized my family life had been built on lies. Emily didn't confront James right away. She decided to gather more evidence before accusing him. But the biggest blow was still ahead. Realizing that the betrayal came not only from her husband but also from her own sister. The day Emily discovered the whole truth started like any other. She woke up early, made breakfast for the kids, and sent them off to school. James left for work, citing an important client meeting. Emily decided it was time to act. She called Sarah and invited her to lunch, supposedly to discuss their parents' upcoming anniversary. Sarah, suspecting nothing, agreed. They arranged to meet at a small cafe downtown. Emily arrived at the cafe first. She chose a table in the corner, where she had a clear view of the whole room. When Sarah walked in, Emily immediately noticed her nervousness. "Hey, sis," Emily said, trying to keep calm. "It's been a while." Sarah sat down, avoiding direct eye contact with her sister. They ordered food, and the conversation began with plans for their parents' anniversary. However, Emily soon got to the point. "Sarah, I need to ask you something," Emily began, pulling a folder from her bag. "What is going on between you and James?" Sarah paled. "What are you talking about?" She tried to joke, but her voice trembled. Emily laid the photographs taken by the private detective on the table. They showed James and Sarah leaving a hotel holding hands. "Explain this to me," Emily demanded. Sarah burst into tears. "Emily, please forgive me," she sobbed. "I never wanted it to turn out this way. It just happened." Emily listened to her sister's confession, feeling the anger growing inside her. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "Almost a year," Sarah admitted. "We tried to end it, really, but every time." Emily cut her off. She stood up from the table. "You're my sister, Sarah. How could you?" With those words, she left the cafe, leaving Sarah crying at the table. Emily's next step was to confront James. She returned home and waited for him to come back from work. When James walked into the house, he immediately sensed the tension. "We need to talk," Emily said, pointing to a chair in the living room. James sat down, feeling that something irreversible was about to happen. Emily silently placed the photos in front of him. "It's not what you think," James began to defend himself. "And what am I supposed to think?" Emily asked. "You've been sleeping with my sister behind my back for a year. What's there to misunderstand?" James tried to take Emily's hand, but she pulled away. "I love you, Emily. It was a mistake," he said. "A mistake?" Emily exclaimed. "A mistake is when you slip up once. This is betrayal." Their conversation went on for hours. James confessed everything, explained how his relationship with Sarah began, and how they had tried to stop but couldn't. Emily listened in silence, feeling her world crumble around her. "I want you to leave," she finally said. "Right now. Pack your things and go." James tried to argue, talked about the kids, about how they could fix everything. But Emily was firm. "Leave before I say something I'll regret," she said. After James left, Emily called her best friend, Lisa. She arrived half an hour later with a bottle of wine and a box of tissues. "What are you going to do next?" Lisa asked after Emily finished telling her the whole story. "I don't know," Emily replied. "But I know one thing. I can never trust James or Sarah again." That night, Emily didn't sleep. She went over the past years of their marriage in her mind, trying to understand where it all went wrong. In the morning, she would have to explain to the kids why their dad hadn't slept at home. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight, she allowed herself to just cry, mourning her broken marriage and the betrayal of the two people closest to her. The evening before James's death was extraordinarily tense. It had been a week since his affair with Sarah was exposed. James was temporarily staying at a hotel, trying to patch things up with Emily and the children. That evening, he came to the house to talk to his wife. Emily reluctantly let him in. The children were already asleep, and the couple settled in the kitchen. "I want to make things right," James began. "Give me a chance." Emily looked at him with bitterness. "How can you fix a year of lies and betrayal?" she asked. Their conversation quickly turned into a heated argument. Neighbors later told the police they heard shouting from the Harris house around 9:30 p.m. "It was unusual," recalled Martha Johnson, who lived next door. "They always seemed like such a quiet, happy family." At 10:15 p.m., James left the house. Witnesses saw him get into his car and drive away. Emily stayed home alone with the children. At the same time, Sarah was in her apartment on the other side of town. She was trying to call James, but he wasn't answering. At 10:30 p.m., she sent him a message. "We need to talk. It's important." Surveillance cameras recorded James pulling into the parking lot of Joe's Bar at 10:45 p.m. Bartender Mike Dawson recalled, "He looked distressed. He ordered a double whiskey and just stared off into space." At 11:30 p.m., James left the bar. His steps were unsteady, but he refused the offer to call a cab. "I'm fine," he told the bartender. "I just need some fresh air." The last time James was seen alive was at 11:45 p.m. A camera at a gas station captured him buying a bottle of water and some aspirin. The cashier noted that James seemed agitated and kept checking his phone. At midnight, Sarah sent James another message. "Call me as soon as you can. It's about Emily." Emily, meanwhile, spent the evening at home. She called her friend Lisa around 11 p.m. Emily seemed upset, Lisa told investigators. She said she didn't know what to do about James and the whole situation. At 12:30 a.m., the Harris's neighbors heard the sound of a car pulling up. "I looked out the window and saw James parking by the house," said Tom Peters, who lived across the street. "He got out of the car and headed toward the house. That's the last I saw." This was the last known movement of James Harris. The next morning at 7:15 a.m., Emily discovered James's body in their living room. She immediately called the police and an ambulance. Patrol Officer John Smith was the first to arrive on the scene. "When I entered the house, Mrs. Harris was hysterical," he recalled. "She pointed to the living room, where I found Mr. Harris's body. James was lying face down on the floor. Nearby was a shattered vase, its pieces scattered around. There was a visible wound on the back of James's head. The paramedics who arrived pronounced James Harris dead. The time of death was preliminarily estimated to be between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. The detectives who arrived at the scene immediately noticed several details. First, the front door had not been forced open, suggesting that James had either let the killer in himself or the killer had a key. Second, there were no signs of a struggle in the house, except for the broken vase in the living room. Emily was in a state of shock. "I woke up in the morning and came downstairs," she told the police. "And then I saw him. Oh God, I can't believe this." Sarah learned of James's death from the police, who came to her home around 9 a.m. "I was in shock," she said. "I couldn't believe James was dead. We had just spoken a few days ago." Both women insisted on their innocence. Both had alibis for the night of the murder, and both became the main suspects in the case of James Harris's death. Detectives Michael Rodriguez and Sarah Chun arrived at the crime scene at 8:30 a.m. As experienced investigators, they immediately began their work, starting with the examination of the crime scene and gathering initial statements. The first thing they did was examine the body of James Harris. The victim was lying face down, with a broken vase nearby, noted Detective Rodriguez in his report. There was a visible wound on the back of his head, likely from a blunt object. The medical examiner, Dr. Alex Morgan, arrived at 9:15 a.m. After a preliminary examination, he stated, "Death occurred approximately between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m. The cause of death appears to be a head injury, probably from a strong blow. A full autopsy will be required to determine the exact time and cause of death." Detective Chun focused on inspecting the house. The front door was not forced open, suggesting that the killer either had a key or the victim let them in, she noted. There were no clear signs of a struggle in the house, except for the broken vase in the living room. Meanwhile, Detective Rodriguez began questioning the witnesses. The first was Emily Harris. "I can't believe this happened," she said through tears. "We argued in the evening. James left. I went to bed around midnight and woke up in the morning to find him like this." Emily spoke about the recent revelation of James's affair with her sister, Sarah. "Yes, we had problems, but I would never harm him," she insisted. Next, Sarah was questioned. The detectives arrived at her home around 10 a.m. "I was home all night," Sarah claimed. "I tried to reach James, but he didn't answer my calls or messages." Both women denied any involvement in the murder and insisted on their innocence. However, their accounts of the previous night's events were contradictory. The detectives also questioned the neighbors. Tom Peters, who lived across the street, reported, "I saw James return home around 12:30 a.m. He looked upset." Bartender Mike Dawson confirmed that James had been at Joe's bar that evening. He had a few drinks of whiskey and left around 11:30 p.m. He seemed distressed. Investigators seized James's cell phone, which was found in the pocket of his jacket. The last messages and calls were from Sarah, the technical expert noted. She was persistently trying to contact him in the evening and at night. During the search of the house, the detectives found several important pieces of evidence. In the kitchen trash can, they found a torn photograph of James and Sarah. In Emily and James's bedroom, they found recently drafted divorce papers that had not yet been signed. The motive for both suspects is obvious. Detective Rodriguez remarked to his partner, "Emily could have killed James over the affair and the impending divorce. Sarah might have done it out of fear of exposure or James's refusal to leave his wife." Detective Chin added, "But both have alibis. Emily was at home with the kids, and Sarah claims she spent the night at her apartment. We need to check surveillance cameras and phone records to confirm or refute their statements." Over the next few days, the investigators continued gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses. They reviewed James's financial documents, his work connections, and verified the alibis of Emily and Sarah. The autopsy results confirmed the initial findings. Death was caused by a blow to the back of the head with a blunt object, Dr. Morgan reported. The force of the blow suggests that the killer was likely acting in a state of intense emotional agitation. Despite the intense investigation, the detectives could not confidently point to a specific suspect. The evidence was circumstantial, and the testimonies were conflicting. We have two women, both with a motive, both with questionable alibis, and both claiming their innocence, Detective Rodriguez concluded. This case won't be easy to solve. 2 weeks after the murder of James Harris, the investigation had hit a dead end. Detectives Rodriguez and Chun sat in their office, discussing the case. Let's go over the sisters' statements again, Rodriguez suggested, opening the file with the documents. Emily Harris insisted on her innocence. She claimed that after arguing with James, she went to bed around midnight and woke up in the morning to find his body. I loved him, despite the affair, she said through tears. I could never have hurt him. Her alibi was supported by the children, who were asleep in the nearby rooms and didn't hear anything suspicious during the night. However, the detectives knew that the children's testimonies could not be considered reliable in such a situation. Sarah, on the other hand, insisted she spent the entire night at home. I was trying to contact James because I wanted to end our relationship, she explained, but he didn't answer my calls or messages. Footage from surveillance cameras confirmed that Sarah did not leave her house from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. the next day. However, Detective Chin noted, she could have asked someone else to commit the murder. Both have clear motives, Rodriguez sighed. Emily could have killed him over the affair, and Sarah might have done it out of fear of exposure or because James refused to leave his wife. Chun nodded. Yes, but we don't have any direct evidence against either of them. The murder weapon hasn't been found, and there are no fingerprints at the crime scene besides those belonging to family members. The detectives revisited the forensic report. Dr. Morgan confirmed that death was caused by a blunt force trauma to the back of the head. The force of the blow indicates a high level of emotional agitation by the attacker, the report noted. That could point to Emily, Rodriguez suggested. She was furious about the affair. But Sarah could have been desperate if James had decided to leave her, Chin countered. The detectives turned back to analyzing James's financial records. They discovered that a week before his death, he had withdrawn a large amount of cash from his account. Where did this money go? Chin wondered. Rodriguez shook his head. Maybe he was planning to run away? Or was it blackmail? The investigators also reviewed James's phone records. The day before his death, he made several calls to his lawyer and financial advisor. It looks like he was preparing for something, Rodriguez observed. Or running away from something, Chin added. The detectives decided to question James's colleagues again. His secretary, Mary Johnson, reported, in the last few days, Mr. Harris seemed very nervous. He often locked himself in his office and spoke in a whisper on the phone. James's friend and colleague, Michael Thompson, said, James told me he was caught up in his relationships. He didn't know how to get out of this situation without hurting both women. Despite their efforts, the investigation could not move forward. Both suspects had motives and opportunities, but there was no direct evidence pointing to their guilt. We're going in circles, Rodriguez said frustratedly. Every time we think we've found a lead, it goes nowhere. Chen agreed. Maybe we're missing something important. Could there be a third party we don't know about? The detectives decided to carefully reanalyze all the existing data, hoping to find a missed detail that could shed light on this tangled case. One thing is clear, Rodriguez concluded. Someone is lying, and we need to find out who before James Harris's killer gets away with it. The investigation into James Harris's murder took an unexpected turn when detectives Rodriguez and Chun received an anonymous letter. An envelope without a return address was delivered to the police station early in the morning. You are looking in the wrong place, read the message, typed on a plain sheet of paper. Check the surveillance footage at the Shell gas station at the intersection of 5th and Main on the night of the murder. The detectives immediately headed to the indicated gas station. The station manager, Jim Parker, reluctantly gave them access to the surveillance footage. Look right here, Chin said, pointing at the screen. At 12:47 a.m. on the night of the murder, there's a familiar face. The footage clearly showed a person in dark clothing and a baseball cap entering the gas station store. When he turned toward the camera, the detectives gasped in surprise. "That's Mark Wilson, James's colleague," Rodriguez exclaimed. He claimed he was home that night. Further examination of the footage showed that Mark stayed at the gas station for about 10 minutes, bought a bottle of water and a pack of cigarettes, then got into a black sedan and drove off in the direction of the Harris home. The detectives immediately went to the office where James had worked. They found Mark Wilson at his desk. "Mark Wilson, we need to ask you a few questions," Rodriguez began. Wilson looked visibly nervous. "What about? Where were you on the night of James Harris's murder?" Chen asked. "I already told you I was home," Wilson replied, avoiding direct eye contact. "Interesting, because we have surveillance footage showing you buying cigarettes at a gas station near the Harris home about an hour before his death," Rodriguez said. Wilson turned pale. I can explain." At the police station, Mark Wilson finally confessed. "Yes, I was there that night. James called me, he said he needed help. When I arrived, he was in a panic." According to Wilson, James had confided in him that he was tangled in his relationships with Emily and Sarah. He said Sarah was blackmailing him, threatening to tell Emily everything if he didn't leave his wife. "But Emily already knew about the affair," Chin noted. "Yes, but she didn't know everything," Wilson replied. "It turns out James and Sarah were planning to run away together. They even opened a joint bank account in the Cayman Islands." This information shocked the detectives. They immediately requested the bank records of James and Sarah. "Here it is," Rodriguez said, reviewing the documents. "Large transfers to a Cayman Islands account over the past 6 months." Chun shook her head. "But this doesn't explain who killed James." Wilson continued his story. "When I arrived, James wasn't alone. Sarah was there. They were arguing. James was yelling that he wanted to end everything and go back to his family. Sarah was furious." "Did you see Sarah hit James?" Rodriguez asked. Wilson shook his head. "No, I left. James said he would handle it himself. I didn't want to get involved in this messy situation." The detectives exchanged glances. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. They immediately went to Sarah's apartment with a search warrant. In her apartment, they found hidden bloody clothes and a statuette that perfectly matched the shape of the wound on James's head. When Sarah was arrested, she finally confessed, "I didn't mean to kill him. He said he was leaving me, that it was all a mistake. I just couldn't take it." Emily Harris was stunned when she learned the whole truth. "I thought I knew them both," she told the detectives. "How could I have been so wrong?" The case of James Harris was closed. Sarah was charged with second-degree murder. Mark Wilson was charged with obstruction of justice for withholding information. Detectives Rodriguez and Chun knew this case would stay with them for a long time. "Sometimes the truth is more complicated than we can imagine," Rodriguez remarked. Chun nodded. "And often, it's the people closest to us who can cause the most pain." The trial for the murder of James Harris began 6 months after his death. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, relatives, and curious citizens all gathered to hear the conclusion of this tangled story of love, betrayal, and death. Prosecutor Alex Martinez began his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not just a murder case. It is a story of how passion and jealousy can lead to tragedy." Sarah Thompson, pale and gaunt, sat next to her lawyer. Her defense attorney, seasoned lawyer John Baker, argued that the murder was not premeditated. "My client acted under extreme emotional distress," he stated. "She did not plan to kill James Harris. It was an unfortunate accident, the result of an argument that got out of control." Over the following weeks, the court heard from numerous witnesses. Emily Harris testified with tears in her eyes. "I loved my husband, despite his affair, and I loved my sister. I never thought she was capable of something like this." Mark Wilson, James's colleague, recounted the events of that fateful night. "James called me. He was in a panic. When I arrived, Sarah was there. They were arguing. I should have stayed. Maybe then." Detectives Rodriguez and Chun presented the evidence they had gathered. Sarah's bloodied clothes, the statuette, the murder weapon, and the surveillance footage. A key moment in the trial was the testimony of forensic psychiatrist Dr. Elizabeth Green. The defendant was under extreme emotional stress. Her actions were impulsive, not premeditated. Sarah Thompson also took the stand. She did not try to deny her guilt but insisted that she did not intend to kill James. "I loved him," she said through tears. "When he said he was going back to Emily, I just lost control. I don't remember grabbing the statuette. I just wanted him to listen to me." In his closing argument, Prosecutor Martinez pressed for a second-degree murder conviction. Sarah Thompson had the opportunity to stop. She could have walked away. Instead, she chose violence. Defense attorney Baker urged the jury to show leniency. "My client deeply regrets her actions. She is not a monster but a person who made a terrible mistake in a moment of emotional breakdown." After 3 days of deliberations, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of manslaughter. Judge Michael Donovan delivered the sentence. "Sarah Thompson, the court sentences you to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. As Sarah was led out of the courtroom, she looked at her sister, Emily. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Emily turned away, unable to meet her gaze. Mark Wilson was sentenced to 2 years probation for obstructing justice. After the trial, detectives Rodriguez and Chun stood on the courthouse steps. "Was justice served?" Chun asked. Rodriguez shook his head. "The law, yes, but in cases like this, there is no real justice. Too many lives are destroyed." Emily Harris left the courthouse surrounded by family. She did not speak to the press, only saying briefly, "Now I have to move on. For my children." This case became one of the most talked about in the city's history. It reminded everyone of how thin the line is between love and hate and how a single rash decision can change many lives forever. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories that are coming out every day.